G'day folks, welcome to my channel. In this video, I want to talk about the 3 tithes of the Old Testament under the Mosaic law, what they were and what the tithes were used for, so that you can have absolute certainty that tithing is not a requirement in the new covenant. Let's quickly get Abraham out the way. As I've said many times on this channel, Abraham never tithed from his income. He tithed once from the spoils of war, and he returned the other 90% to the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah because it was originally stolen from them and it belonged to them. So therefore, Abraham cannot be used as an example of tithing because he never tithed from his income. There's no evidence whatsoever to suggest that Abraham tithed from his income. He tithed once from the spoils of war. But I want to look now at the 3 tithes under the Mosaic law, what they were and what they were used for. The first one is the festival tithe. The second one is the poor tithe. And the third one is the levitical tithe. Let's look first of all at the festival tithe. If we go to Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 22 to 23, we read this: Thou shalt surely tithe all the increase of thy seed, that the field bringeth forth year by year. And thou shalt eat before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose to place his name there, the tithe of thy corn, of thy wine, and of thine oil, and the firstlings of thy herds and of thy flocks, that thou mayest learn to fear the Lord thy God always. This is the first tithe. And notice here that it is not a tithe from the fisherman's produce. It's not a tithe from the merchant's produce. It's not a tithe from the carpenter or the blacksmith. This is a tithe on the farmers. It's purely a tithe on the farmers. In fact, every tithe is only ever a tithe on the farmers and never a tithe on merely someone's income. Certainly not a tithe on money. And remember, money is used 32 times in the book of Genesis alone. Silver is also used, silver coins, as well as shekels. The word shekel appears 32 times in the first 5 books of Moses. So clearly money was used. Nevertheless, every time you read about the contents of the tithe, no matter what tithe it is, including this festival tithe here, it's only ever farm produce from the land. That's all it ever is. It can never be anything else. And it has to be from the land of Israel. It's not the land of some other place. It's not the land of Egypt. It's not America, anything like that. It has to be the land of Israel. So this tithe here is a yearly tithe when they celebrated the blessings of God in Jerusalem, and they took the tithe to Jerusalem and they consumed it there with everybody else in celebration of what God had provided. Now, as we keep reading, there's a little bit more information about this tithe here in the text. So let's keep going. Verse 24, And if the way be too long for thee, so that thou art not able to carry it, or if the place be too far from thee, which the Lord thy God shall choose to set his name there, when the Lord thy God has blessed thee, then thou shalt turn it into money, and bind up the money in thine hand, and shalt go unto the place which the Lord thy God shall choose. And thou shalt bestow that money for whatsoever thy soul lusteth or desireth after, for oxen, or for sheep, or for wine, or for strong drink, or for whatsoever thy soul desireth. And thou shalt eat there before the Lord thy God. That word there is consume. Thou shalt consume there before the Lord thy God, and thou shalt rejoice, thou and thine household, and the Levite that is within thy gates. Thou shalt not forsake him, for he has no part nor inheritance with thee. You see, the Levite, they didn't have any land that they could farm. It was only the other tribes that were given land that they could farm. And so they were not to forsake the Levites from their city when they went to this place, which was Jerusalem, to celebrate the blessings of God. But it's very clear here that they were, if the place was too far, they were to sell their tithe and bring that money to Jerusalem and buy whatsoever their soul lusteth or desireth after. And it could be food, it could be wine or strong drink. That they could buy whatever they wanted, and they were to consume that in celebration with their household and with the Levite from their town. That is the first tithe, the festival tithe. Some people try to point to this money aspect, but this money is not being given to the temple to pay for anything. This money is being used to buy replacement goods in Jerusalem, food and drink, so that they can celebrate with their household and with the Levite by consuming it themselves. Not giving it to someone else, they consumed it themselves. That's the first tithe. Now, can that apply to the New Testament? No. There's no way to apply this to the New Testament. First of all, we're not under the law of Moses. That's an obvious one. Secondly, most Christians are not farmers in the land of Israel. Those 2 points can apply to all 3 tithes and completely wipe out the idea that tithing is commanded in the new covenant. Thirdly, we don't celebrate this festival anymore. This festival is over. We don't celebrate this anymore. You could choose to celebrate it, I guess, if you want to be a little bit, like a Messianic Jew or something like that. But that's purely your choice to do that sort of thing, celebrating Passover and different things like that. You can do that if you want to, but it's not a commandment. It's not required of you. So therefore, you cannot say that this tithe is commanded of Christians in the new covenant. The second tithe is the poor tithe. If we continue where we left off in Deuteronomy chapter 14, we're at verse 28, and it says this: "At the end of 3 years thou shalt bring forth all the tithe of thine increase the same year, and lay it up within thy gates." So this is a tithe that didn't take place every year. This is a tithe that took place every 3 years, and it was only based upon that third year. So when you add all 3 tithes up, we're going to look at the third one in a moment, it adds up to about 23%, which is interesting because that's roughly what most Western governments charge in taxes. And that's really what the tithe was. And when we conclude this, you'll see that the Mosaic tithe was really a government tithe to pay for the government. It was a theocratic government, so it included payment of priests who taught the law and made judgments of the law when there were legal disputes. But let's keep looking here. "At the end of 3 years, thou shalt bring forth all the tithe of thine increase the same year, and lay it up within thy gates. And the Levite, because he has no part nor inheritance with thee, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow, which are within thy gates, shall come, and shall eat and be satisfied, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all the work of thine hand which thou doest." It's very clear from this passage that this is a tithe for the poor and for the needy, for the fatherless, for the widow, for the stranger, and for the Levite who had no land of his own, so he couldn't farm to produce his own food. This is a tithe that is basically equivalent to modern day social security. So this is not something that is being used to pay for the temple or to pay an extravagant wage to a millionaire pastor or billionaire pastor. It's not about paying for a luxurious building for everybody to meet in. This tithe has nothing to do with any of that. This tithe is about meeting the needs of the poor, and it's 1/10 of all the farm produce in the land of Israel. This is the tithe that Malachi referred to in Malachi 3:10 when he said, "Bring all the tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house." Food for who? Food for the poor, the fatherless, the widow, the stranger. That's what this tithe is for, and that is the tithe that Malachi referred to. Now, this does not apply to the New Testament. Why? Number one, we're not living under the Mosaic law. Number two, we are not farmers. Most Christians, I'd say at least 99% of Christians, are not farmers in the land of Israel. And thirdly, we have social security in most governments that take care of that. Now, if you're in a country where you don't have social security, you're probably struggling to feed yourself. But if you did have enough, then I guess there is a Christian duty to help poor people, and there's a principle here. Nevertheless, this is not a tithe requirement for you to give money to the church every Sunday, every week from your income. Why? Again, We're not under the Mosaic law. Most Christians are not farmers living in the land of Israel, and we have social security to take care of that in most countries. Now let's get to this final and last tithe, and that is the Levitical tithe. This is found in Leviticus chapter 27, verse 30 to 32. Now it's important to note that every other scriptural reference throughout the rest of the Bible about tithing is referring to one of these three tithes. It's not inventing new tithes. So when you point to other scriptures, I have people that try to point to other passages and they say, what about this tithe and that tithe? All of those passages are referring to one of these three tithes. Now let's look at this third tithe, the Levitical tithe. Leviticus chapter 27, verse 30 to 32, and it says this: "And all the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the tree, is the Lord's, and it is holy unto the Lord. And if a man will at all redeem aught of his tithes, he shall add thereto the fifth part thereof. And concerning the tithe of the herd, or of the flock, or of whatsoever passeth under the rod, the tenth shall be holy unto the Lord." Notice here straight away again that this is farm produce. This is not talking about a carpenter bringing 10% of his carpentry. This is not talking about a fisherman bringing 10% of his catch. This is not talking about a merchant bringing 10% of the money he made. You couldn't bring those things and offer them as a tithe to God. They were not acceptable. Only farm produce from the land of Israel was acceptable as tithing. That's all you could bring, nothing else. Now, the next point I want to make as we continue on to verse 20 here in the same chapter is that the tithes all went to the Levites. That's the next point that I want to make here. Let's read this. "Then the Lord said to Aaron, You shall have no inheritance in the land, nor shall ye have any portion among them. I am your portion, and your inheritance among the children of Israel. Behold, I have given the children of Levi all the tithes in Israel, as an inheritance, in return for the work which they perform, the work of the tabernacle of meeting." We're going to look at what that work was in detail in a moment. But the first thing I want to point out here is that the tithe went to the Levites, okay? Only the descendants of Aaron could be priests, and that was a very small number of Levites. Every priest was a Levite, but not every Levite was a priest. The majority of Levites were not priests, but they assisted the priests in the work of the temple. The next point is that only a tenth of the tenth went to the priests. In other words, 1% of all the farm produce in Israel went to the priests. They didn't get 10%. 10% was not given to the priests. Only 1%, a tenth of the tenth, was given to the priests. Let me prove that to you. Numbers 18, and we're up to verse 26. "Speak thus to the Levites and say to them, When you take from the children of Israel the tithes which I have given you from them as your inheritance, then you shall offer up a heave offering of it to the Lord, a tenth of the tithe." So the Levites here were to set aside a tenth of the tithe, 1%. Let's keep reading. Verse 27, "And your heave offering shall be reckoned to you as though it was the grain of the threshing floor and as the fullness of the winepress." In other words, because the Levites didn't do any farming themselves, the tenth that they receive, when they set aside a tenth of that tenth, that's like their tithing. And that tithing, we're just going to see in a moment, goes to the priest. Let's keep reading. Verse 28, "Thus you shall also offer a heave offering to the Lord from all your tithes which you receive from the children of Israel. And you shall give the Lord's heave offering from it to Aaron the priest." So Aaron the high priest and his sons only got a tenth of a tenth, that is 1% of all of the farm produce of the land of Israel. Now, it's important to note that the priest's role was not primarily to teach the word of God. The priest's role was primarily to do the sacrifices, to offer the sacrifices. Now, that was a lot of work. It was manual labor. There was sacrifice after sacrifice, day in, day out. It was hard work, and the Levites were there to help them. They also had other roles like medical inspection of skin diseases and things like that. If you go through the book of Leviticus, you'll see that they had quite a large role within the nation of Israel. It was a very small part of it was teaching the word of God. Secondly, we can see that the majority of the tithe went to the Levites. They had 9% of all the farm produce in the land of Israel. Now, their role was huge. Yes, they were to help the priests in the temple, but you also see, for example, in Numbers chapter 3, verse 21 to 39, that 22,300 Levites were required to basically look after the tabernacle. Before the temple, it was the tabernacle. It took 22,300 Levites to look after that. You have to remember that it's the gate, the outer fencing, all the furnishing, setting up the temple, packing it down, bringing it back up again, especially through the wilderness. It wasn't always in a set place. It took 22,300 Levites to basically look after that tabernacle with all of its furnishings. Now, what's interesting is that with the story of where Samuel is asked by the people of Israel, they ask him for a king. He prophesies to them and he says to them that when they get a king, that king, it says specifically, go and check out the text, that king was going to take the tenth. In other words, that tenth was no longer going directly to the Levites. It went to the king, and the king administered that tenth. Then, of course, he used the Levites as his government workers. And I want to read to you very clearly in the book of 1 Chronicles, where it specifically lays out the jobs of the Levites. Now, I think it's chapter 23 of 1 Chronicles, all the way to chapter 26. It gives you a lot of detail. But at the beginning in chapter 23, the first 5 verses gives a little concise summary of what the Levites did. So I want to read that to you. Let's look together. 1 Chronicles chapter 23, verse 1 to 5. So when David was old and full of days, he made Solomon his son king over Israel. And he gathered together all the princes of Israel with the priests and the Levites. Now the Levites were numbered from the age of 30 years and upward, and their number by their polls, man by man, was 38,000, of which 20 and 4,000 were to set forward the work of the house of the Lord. Now, this is talking about the building of the temple. The chapter just before that is all about the preparations of the temple. And this here, when it says that they set about the work of the house of the Lord, this is talking about the building of the temple. They were builders. They had all sorts of building skills. They weren't just preachers and teachers that came from seminary. These were people that were had dedicated work skills. Now, we'll keep reading. And 6,000 were officers and judges. These were basically the executive and the judicial branch of the government of Israel, the theocratic government of Israel. And they were spread, when you keep reading the text, they were spread all throughout the land of Israel. They weren't just set in one place. This was the Levites throughout the land of Israel, were the executive government of the theocratic kingdom of Israel and the judicial arm. That's what these Levites were set, what their job was. We keep reading. Moreover, 4,000 were porters. Now, other translations use words like guards or gatekeepers, watchmen. And if you read chapter 26 carefully and look at some of the Hebrew words, you'll see that that is indeed what they were. They were basically temple guards, and they were stationed all around the temple, and there was 4,000 of them. These are the ones receiving the tithe, basically the security guards. Now let's keep reading. And 4,000 praised the Lord with instruments which I made, said David, to praise therewith. Now these singers and musicians, they didn't just sing and play instruments once or twice a week on Sunday. They played every single day. The musicians and the singers played throughout all the sacrifices and offerings that were made by the priests and the Levites. So this was a full-time job, day in, day out, all day. So this wasn't something small, like just a once or twice a week. This is a constant need for singers and musicians, and they were the recipients of the tithe. Now, let's do a little recap. The first tithe was for the yearly tithe festival. We don't celebrate that anymore, and so therefore that's not applicable. The second tithe was for the poor and the needy. That role is filled by the government today, and that makes sense because this was a government tax for the poor and needy in Israel. And then this third tithe is the levitical tithe, which is primarily for people who are offering sacrifices, assisting the priests, guards, government officials, such as judges and the executive government, and these singers that were needed all day, every day. So when you look at this, is this last tithe needed in the new covenant? Absolutely not. First of all, again, as I've said before, we are no longer under the Mosaic law. Secondly, most Christians are not farmers in the land of Israel living under the old covenant. So therefore, just those two arguments alone would remove any need or any basis upon which somebody could say we must tithe in the new covenant. But more importantly here, the whole temple system is done away with. We don't have sacrifices anymore. We don't have to look after the temple anymore. We don't have to have guards. We don't have to have singers and musicians every single day singing at the temple as the sacrifices are being made. Now, we have to understand as well that in the New Testament, there were no religious buildings. You know, when the new covenant was brought in, the temple system was not the focus point of worship. People met in homes. There is no mention whatsoever anywhere in the New Testament of a church building. In fact, Jesus strongly implied the opposite. Jesus said that there's coming a day where they won't worship in these religious places anymore, but instead people will worship God in spirit and in truth. And so when we look at the New Testament, we don't see any need for a church building. Now, is it wrong for people to get together and have a church building? Well, not really. I'm not going to say it's wrong for people to do that. But if a pastor is insisting that everybody meet in a church building, then that pastor should foot the bill. It's as simple as that. If he wants everybody to meet every week in a church building, then he needs to pay for it. If there's people in the church that say, you know what, we'd really like to meet in a church building instead of in our homes, well, those people that want to do that ought to be the ones paying for it. A bit like the synagogues. You know, synagogues were never commanded of God. God never commanded God's people to meet in synagogues. Nonetheless, I think it was during the exile period in Babylon, they began to build synagogues and meet in synagogues. And usually there was a patron that paid for it, or the community got together and funded it, but there was no command from God that everybody pay 10% to fund the local synagogue. There was no command like that. People did that of their own accord. And I would say in the New Testament, people can do that of their own accord. And not everybody had to pay towards the cost of that synagogue. And I would argue this, I would prefer, and I think many Christians would also prefer to meet in homes. But if you're forcing us to come to a building because we can't find a decent home church anywhere because everybody's been conned into this idea that you have to meet in a church building, then the people that want to do that ought to be the ones that foot the bill. I'm not paying for it. I want to meet in homes, and so therefore I don't have to pay for that. The interesting thing as well is that in the synagogue system, those that taught the word of God in the synagogue, they had a job. They probably received some support, and there's definitely a basis for financial support of people that preach and teach the word of God. Nonetheless, there's no argument that can be made for a full-time wage. And it seems to me that it's more logical, because it's not a full-time job. Preaching once a week is not a full-time job, and counseling people should be the job of every believer. And really, the pulpit should be shared and not hogged by the pastor. Nonetheless, I don't think there's a need for a full-time pastor in a church if you follow the teaching of the priesthood of all believers. If you allow people to exercise their gifts, if you allow people to contribute to the ministry, there's no need whatsoever for a full-time pastor. And so therefore pastors should be able to go out and get themselves a job. So with that in mind, it seems very clear that there is no basis whatsoever to require Christians to pay 10% of their income. And I would argue as much as this, that you can't even ask them to give free will offerings. You can't command anyone and say you must give free will offerings, because there's no verse anywhere in the Bible that commands us to give free will offerings. Why? Because there were no church buildings in the New Testament. Very clear. Now, I think if you disagree with me, look, if you've got some arguments to counter what I've presented, then please, by all means, leave a comment in the comment section or email me. I'm going to put this on my website, so probably within the next 24 hours, I'll have all of my notes on my website, which I'll link to in the description below. I hope you've liked this video. If you have, please consider subscribing. Give me a thumbs up, hit the bell notification button. I'll see you in the comments section, and you'll see me in my next video.